All right, if you've got your Bibles, go ahead and turn to Romans chapter 11, verse 1 through 16. Romans chapter 11, verse 1 through 16. And today we're going to start looking at chapter 11 of Romans. And you can see from the title on your listening guide, it says God and Israel Part 1. So this deals with Israel. So I know what some of y'all are already thinking right now. I'm not Jewish. I'm tired. I'm going to check out. And then when he prays the final prayer, then I'll say amen and we'll head on out. Don't do that, okay? Because this is actually important for us. We're going to see us in this chapter. But the other is, if this chapter deals with, does God keep his promises? Does God keep his promises to Israel? And if God keeps his promises to Israel, then that means God will keep his promises to us. So this is actually an important chapter for us to look at. So looking on your listening guide, the big idea on your listening guide is God has always had a plan for Israel. God has always had a plan for Israel. So let's go ahead and get started. Chapter 11, starting in verse 1. This is Paul writing. He says, I say then, God has not rejected his people, has he? May it never be. For I am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham of the tribe of Benjamin. And God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. Or do you not know what the scripture says in the passage about Elijah? How he pleads with God against Israel. Lord, they have killed your prophets, they have torn down your altars, and I alone am left, and they are seeking my life. But what is it that the divine response to him? I've kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. In the same way, then, there has also come to be a present time a remnant according to God's gracious choice. But if it is by grace, it is no longer on the basis of works. Otherwise, grace is no longer grace. All right, we'll stop there. We'll start going through this. The first point on your listening guide is God has not turned his back on Israel. God has not turned his back on Israel. So Paul's going to address a question. And he asked it right off because he's thinking, they may be thinking this. So let me just clear this up. Let me get this out of the way. And that is, did God reject his chosen people? Israel was his chosen people. And so did God reject them? God had made promises to Abraham. God had made promises to David. He had made promises all throughout Israel's history. But had he abandoned them? And Paul answers the question, and he says in verse 1, may it never be. He was saying the strongest way possible, no. God hasn't turned his back on his people, which is good news for us, because if he didn't turn his back on them, he's not going to turn his back on us. So that's good news for us also, that if he doesn't do that to them, he won't do it to us. But he's going to give us reasons why, so that we can understand that. But before I jump into the reasons he gives, I thought I would start with the reason that Jesus gave, because he's a pretty good guy to start with too, right? So Jesus, when he was doing the Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew chapter 7, he had this phrase, and y'all probably heard this before. Enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is broad that leads to destruction, and there are many who enter through it. For the gate is small and the way is narrow that leads to life, and there are few who find it. He was addressing the Jews at that point. He was speaking as a Jewish teacher to the Jews. So he tells them, many will pick the wide gate that leads to destruction, but only few will pick the narrow gate that leads to life. You know what he's telling us there? There's going to be a remnant. Remnant means small amount. Not huge amount, but a small amount. So Jesus was talking about a remnant. And then Paul is going to go into that there was a remnant also for Israel. And he's going to use Old Testament to bring that in. But the first thing he's going to do is he's going to use himself. Because look what he does. He says, has God rejected us? He said, may it never be. He said, for I too am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham of the tribe of Benjamin. So he's saying that God picked me. God picked me. I'm a remnant. Just like all the others before me, I'm a remnant also. Now, if we think about him, he was the main missionary because in the book of Acts it follows him. We get a lot of the books that are written in the New Testament are from him. So he was the main missionary going out, spreading the gospel for the Gentiles, but also the Jews. He went out to them too. But if we think about Paul beforehand, he was Jewish and he was completely against the church. Y'all realize that? The New Testament church, he was completely against the New Testament church. I want you to think back, for those of you who have accepted Christ, to when you accepted Christ. Think back to who probably shared the gospel with you. Maybe it was a parent, maybe it was a friend, maybe it was a family member, but think back to when you accepted Christ. Now, for the ones that haven't, at the end of the service, I'll be down front, and I'll be glad to share with you how you can have a relationship with Jesus Christ, because we all have to come to him. We all have to realize we need forgiveness, that we've all messed up, we've all fallen short of his glory, and he gives us that forgiveness through Jesus Christ. And so if we think about when we accepted Christ, somebody probably shared with us the gospel. Parent, friend, teacher, somebody shared the gospel with you. But when we think about Paul, Paul had a completely different conversion. Remember, he was going to Damascus, and he was going to Damascus to actually hunt down Christians. He had letters to bring them back to Jerusalem so they would stand trial, and most likely they would be killed. And so he's going to Damascus with letters in hand saying he has the authority to bring them back. And then he's blinded by a light. And when he's blinded by that light, Jesus speaks to him. You remember what he said to him? He said, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting?" He didn't say the church. "Why are you persecuting me?" Jesus said that when you're persecuting the church, you're persecuting me because they're my body. And so from that, the gospel was shared to him by Jesus Christ himself. God was ensuring that there would be a remnant. He went to Paul directly and shared the gospel with him directly to ensure that there would be a remnant. So now Paul first says, think of me, but then he's going to go to the Old Testament. He's going to say, here's another example where God is making sure that there is a remnant. He says, verse 2, God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. Or do you not know what the scripture says in the passage about Elijah, how he pleads with God against Israel? Lord, they have killed your prophets, and they have torn down your altars, and I alone am left, and they are seeking my life. So let's figure out what's going on with there, because there's a lot going on with that. If you don't know the story, then you're like, okay, who's Elijah? Elijah was a prophet. God was using him, and Elijah, God used him in a mighty way. A lot of different ways, but in one story, it was a mighty way. The Israelites were starting to serve Baal. Baal was another god that they were starting to serve. And Elijah said, all right, here's what we're going to do. You get the priest from Baal, and you bring them forward, and we're going to have two altars, one altar to God and one altar to Baal. And we're going to let them go first, because we'll let them be, well, I'll be nice. I'll let them go first. So he says to them, you build an altar, and you ask Baal to send down fire for this altar. Well, they build their altar. There's like 400 of them there. They're crying out to Baal. They're crying out. All morning long, they're crying. He starts to trash talk them. He's like, maybe your God's asleep. Maybe you need to scream a little bit louder. Maybe he can't hear you. Maybe he just doesn't want to answer. They start to cut themselves thinking maybe that'll get him to answer. Guess what? Baal never answered. You know why? Baal's not a god. Elijah comes. He says, all right, let's build ours. They were in a drought at that point in time, so they build the altar. And then he says, that's too easy for God. Bring some pitchers of water. Pour it all over the altar. They poured it over it. They made a trough around the altar, and it was starting to fill up. He said, one's not enough. Bring the water again. They dump it again. He says, no, that's not enough. Bring it again. So they dump it again. Then he calls out to God and says, God, I want everybody to see who you are and what you're capable of. God sends down fire. It engulfs the altar. It dries up all the water that is there. And everybody knows who God is. Elijah then says, kill their prophets. Kill their priests. And all of Baal's priests were killed. After that, there's this woman called Jezebel. Jezebel was the queen at that time. She said, I don't like this, because she believed in Baal. And so she asked for Elijah to be killed. If somebody was wanting to kill you, what would you do? Would you hang around there, or would you leave? He left. He said, I think it's in my best interest to leave. So he left, and he goes, and when he goes, he comes to God, and he says, they have killed your prophets, they have torn down your altars, and I alone am left, and they are seeking my life. He says, I'm it. And then God comes back, and he answers him. Look at verse 4, but what is it? In the divine response, I have kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. Elijah didn't realize God had a remnant already in place. And Paul's wanting the Jewish Christians to know, and also all of us to know, there is a remnant. God had a remnant. God had a plan for the Israelites. And that was that he was going to provide for them through a remnant. But then Paul then goes in to talk about how this remnant is chosen. Look at verse 5. He says, in the same way, there has also come to be at present time a remnant according to God's gracious choice. But if it is by grace, it is no longer on the basis of works. Otherwise, grace is no longer grace. So he tells how they are chosen. And he says, it is by grace that they are chosen. God's grace that they are chosen. One scholar put it this way on these verses. He said, Paul means this: what guarantees that there will always be a faithful remnant is not that there is always a set of good, decent people who will believe, but rather that there is always the grace of God. It is God who preserves the remnant. Those who believe do so entirely because of his grace. So Israel, God wanted to make sure that there would be a remnant, and he shows them how they should come to him, how they receive righteousness. It's not by works. It's all by grace through faith. And that's where Paul starts to head to next. Verse 7, it says, what then? What Israel is seeking, it is not obtained, but those who were chosen obtained it, and the rest were hardened. Just as it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes to see not, and ears to hear not, down to this very day. And David says, let their table become a snare and a trap and a stumbling block and retribution to them. Let their eyes be darkened to see not, and bend their backs forever. So here we can see that Paul is going to say the remnant had a choice just like we have a choice. He's going to talk about that each individual Israelite has the choice to make. Am I going to follow God by faith, or am I going to try to work my way into heaven? This past week, I was trying to figure out a good illustration to talk about this, that you got a choice. You can pick this or you can pick this. And a movie popped in my mind, and I'm like, I don't know if I should do that movie. But then a devotional came from Tony Evans, and it had the exact same illustration. I'm like, all right, God, you're telling me that I should share this with y'all. So I'm going to share it with y'all, okay? How many of y'all have seen The Matrix? If you haven't, I will try not to spoil it for you, all right? Okay, but it was made in 1999, so if you hadn't seen it by now, chances are you're probably not going to see it. All right, so The Matrix is that there's the main character, his name was Thomas Anderson. He was a computer programmer by day, and at night he was a computer hacker. We can relate to that, right? Because we have people hacking all the time. And so he hacks at nighttime, and then he starts to get a message, and he goes by the name Neo, that he hacks by. But he gets a message from this other gentleman. And this other gentleman, Morpheus, says, I'd like to meet with you. So they meet, and when they meet, I'm giving you like the cliff notes, the abbreviated cliff notes, okay? You'll have to watch the movie to catch it all. But Morpheus says, all right, do you want to know what's really happening in the world today or not? Do you want to keep going on in your life and just be clueless about what's going on, or do you really want to know what's happening? Here's your choice. I'm going to give you two choices. One, there's a blue pill. If you take the blue pill, that means that you just go on about your life and you really don't know what's happening in life. You just kind of forget all of this and go back to your nothingness life. Or if you take the red pill, you will truly see how things are. And Thomas Anderson, he had to decide which one he was going to take. I'm not going to tell you which one he picked, okay? Because if you haven't seen the movie, you'll just have to watch the movie and say, all right, which one did he pick? But the thing is, the Israelites were the exact same way. They had to decide, am I going to go to God by faith, or am I going to go to God by works? And so Paul then goes to the Old Testament again to talk about a time where they had to decide what they were going to do. And so he goes, in verse 8, it says, and just as it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes to see not, and ears to hear not, down to this very day. What's happening there is that Paul is talking about Isaiah, who is talking about Moses when Moses had talked to the Israelites. And Moses warned them that if they went against God, God would bring in spiritual blindness on them. And so Paul is saying that's what happens to the Israelites today. If they try to approach God by works only and not by faith, then God blinds their eyes. Now, I know what some of y'all are saying. Now, wait a minute now. That seems a little harsh, right? That God would harden their hearts, that God would not allow them to see what's happening there. Scholars call this judicial hardening, meaning that God has hardened their heart because of the choice that they made. Not just to harden their heart, but He's hardened it because of the choice that they made. It's a punishment for having a proud heart, that they're going to approach God on their terms. They're going to work their way into heaven. And because of that, he says, well, if you're going to do that, then guess what? I'm going to harden your heart because of that. And he quotes the Old Testament to show that, but then he also quotes the Old Testament again, showing that God has always treated Israel like this. Look at verse 9. He says, and David says, let their table become a snare and a trap and a stumbling block and retribution to them. Let their eyes be darkened to see not and bend their backs forever. Paul is going to use this to say that they were using the works as a stumbling block. And it was so hard for them to understand God is giving grace to people. Because they had always heard you have to work for God's approval. You had to bring sacrifices to God. You had to come to God certain times of the year. And so they said, I've got to work my way into heaven. I've got to work to please God. And now you're coming to me and saying that grace is easy? That all I have to believe in Jesus and that's it? That's too easy. And Paul's saying that's a stumbling block for them because it is so easy. But don't we sometimes think that way too? That grace is too easy? We look at our lives and we're like, I've really messed up. And God's just going to wipe all of that away by me placing my faith in Jesus? Or maybe you're on the other end of that and you're like, look, I've been doing good. I've been going to church. I've been reading my Bible. I've been praying. I've been doing all these things. And then somebody else is going to come in off the streets and God's just going to accept them? Look at all the things that I've done. How's that possible? Because it's grace. God did it all for us through Jesus Christ. We didn't have to do anything. He did it all. He did it all for us. So it is judicial hardening. Sorry, my throat is killing me right now. I think we had too much fun yesterday. So he quotes the Old Testament, and we can see this punishment. It has already existed, but it fits the crime for him also. But we can see that they rejected God's grace. And because of that, they were hardened. Well, that's going to lead us to the next point on your listening guide. God's dealing with Israel after Jesus. God's dealing with Israel after Jesus. All right, so we're going to pick up in verse 11. It says, "And I say then, they did not stumble so as to fall, did they? May it never be. By their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make them jealous. Now, if their transgression is riches for the world, and their failure is riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their fulfillment be? But I am speaking to you who are Gentiles. Inasmuch then as I am an apostle of the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry. And if somehow I might move to jealousy my fellow countrymen, and have saved some of them, for their rejection is the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead?" I'm going to try to make it through. All right, so verse 16 or verse 11 through 16, Paul's going to set out 3 stages that Israel is going through. The first stage is that they transgressed, which led to the gospel coming to the Gentiles. So that's good news that they actually turned their back on God. Y'all realize that? Because it came to us because of that. If you look in the book of Acts, Paul would always go because he was the missionary to the Gentiles. He would go out, he would go to the synagogue first, he would talk about the gospel in the synagogue, but then after the synagogue, because most of them would reject him, he would go out into the courtyards and he would speak to the Gentiles. Think for a minute, what if all of the Jewish people accepted Christ? What would happen then? He would have stayed in the synagogues, right? And people would have said that this is just a revitalization of the church. People were coming back to God. And so it wouldn't have been a movement outside of the Jewish community. It would have been just the Jewish community that would have been moving. So that was the first stage. But then the second stage, we can see that Israel will be envious. We can see that in verse 11 and verse 14. It says in verse 11, "I say then, they did not stumble as to fail, did they? May it never be, but their transgression of salvation has come to the Gentiles to make them jealous." And then verse 14, "If somehow I might come to jealousy my fellow countrymen and save some of them." So Paul uses the word jealousy, or you could use the word envious. What's happening here is the second stage of God dealing with Israel after Jesus is that some of them will come to Jesus because they will see the Gentiles. They will see the Gentiles' relationship with Jesus, and they will be envious of that, and they will want that. When I was first coming out of college, one of my jobs, I was an accountant for a real estate investment company. And one of the guys that Shannon and I, we both worked there. One of the guys we worked with, he was Jewish. And so I probably went about this the wrong way, okay? Because I wanted him to be jealous of the fact that we could eat pork and he couldn't. So that when we went out to eat and we went to a barbecue place, he would always get barbecue chicken. Sometimes if he wanted to splurge, he would get brisket. Now barbecue chicken's good, Brisket's really good if you can afford it, but pork is really good barbecue, right? And so we were all sitting there together, and I'm like, Ben, if you just come on over to our side, you can have all this barbecue right here. I'll even buy you a plate of barbecue if you want. Just come on over. And so I wanted him to be jealous of the fact of what he could eat. That was me back then. I was young. I didn't realize he should have been envious of my relationship with Christ. He should have been envious that I was in a close, tight relationship with him, to the point that he would look at it and say, I want what you have. How do you have that? How can I get that? Me, my naive self back then, pork. Now it would be, I can go to God, a personal relationship with him. And I know that he has covered my sins through Jesus Christ and what he did for me. But that second stage is that the Jewish people should be envious of our relationship with God, because they still feel like they have to work their way in. Can you imagine that? Every night you lay your head down, you're like, well, did I do enough to satisfy God today? Whereas we're covered by grace. Christ did it all for us and we just accept it. There's a huge difference there, right? What if you have a bad day and that's your last day? What happens then? So that's the second stage. First stage is that they transgressed, which means that it came to us. Transgressed means that they rejected Christ, and we think about what they did with Christ. They rejected Christ. Second stage, they should be envious of us. They should want the relationship that we have. So then the third stage is the future, and we see this in verse 14 again. It says, if somehow I might move to jealousy my fellow countrymen and save some of them, for if their rejection is the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? There's going to be a third stage, and that third stage is that there is going to be a large number of Jewish people that accept Christ. Now, I'm not going to get into all of that because we'll hit that next week, okay? That's why there's part 2 of this, not just part 1 of this. But God is going to turn his focus to the Jewish people at a certain point in time. And there will be a large number of them that will be saved at a certain point in time. But Paul is saying that there is a remnant now. And God is still working through that remnant now. Our bottom line, God's plan has not changed. God's plan has not changed. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, okay, what can I get out of this? Well, here's a few things I want you to get out of this, okay? One is that God always knew he would work through a remnant. That means God always had a plan. There are several times in the Bible where it talks about a remnant, that him working through a remnant. So God always had a plan in place. That remnant would always come to faith in him and his works, not our works. So let me ask you, have you accepted Christ on his works, not your works? His plan of salvation, not your plan of salvation. If not, I'll be down front. I'll be glad to share with you how you can have a relationship with him. Another thing is that God keeps his promises. There are some days where that's all you can hold on to, is that God keeps his promises. We see here, God keeps them. Nowadays, do people keep their promises? No, not at all. God always keeps his promises. But the last thing that I want you to get, would somebody be envious of your relationship with Jesus? Would they look at your relationship with Jesus and say, I want that because I know that person is in step with Christ. I feel like that person has a direct call line to Christ. They are so in touch with him. Could somebody say that about you? where they would be envious of your relationship to the point that they would come up to you and say, how do you get that? How do you maintain that? Because I want that, and I currently don't have that. How can I have that? Could somebody say that about your relationship with Christ? If not, what do you need to do to change it? If you don't do anything, guess what's going to happen? Nothing. And you will stay the same. But if you want a deeper relationship with Christ, that means you have to change something. What do you need to change to have that deeper relationship? All right, let's close in prayer.